over the past couple of years, Nintendo has made some really questionable moves, specifically about content they allow on their platform, and most major companies like Sony and like Valve have the same issues. But we do know that Nintendo's censorship is now official because many of their new guidelines are discussing things like sensitive content and include specific rules for what qualifies as sensitive content in the first place. I have a few different things to show off, but before I get into the topic, if you enjoy the content I create, check out the links in the description, join the community in my live streams, and consider supporting through Patreon or YouTube memberships. Now, obviously, companies will try anything to get as many people purchasing their games as possible and supporting their platforms as possible, and Nintendo has always had a pretty family-friendly image. Over the past couple of years, they've done a little bit better in terms of allowing more, we'll just say, risque content on the Switch, where even like Sony is forcing a lot more censorship on companies. But you can't trust companies overall to do everything that is right for their customers, and now Nintendo is rolling out a new eShop publishing guideline for the Switch 2 in Asia right now, seemingly to curb spam games, but there are some very worrying pieces of information here. So Nintendo has quietly made some subtle changes to its guidelines for developers publishing games on its Nintendo Switch 2 eShop, seemingly in an effort to slow an oft-criticized flood of low-effort slop content that's been crowding out other games. They're saying that this is, to curb spam games, but really it just seems like it's another way for Nintendo to control what type of content ends up on their platform and what content they do not allow or ultimately ban or force developers to censor. Now, unfortunately, this was quietly made, right? It's not like they brought a lot of attention to this and tried to keep everybody in the know. It's never that way with these companies. They want to add all of these different rules silently so that, people don't fight back. So earlier this year, it was reported that a growing epidemic of slop games flooding the recommendation page of multiple gaming storefronts, most prevalently on the PlayStation Store and Nintendo eShop. Many of these games shared a number of commonalities: obscure publishing companies with little available public information, very little game content, low quality assets, numerous bugs, inaccurate store page descriptions, and often AI-generated storefront art that wasn't representative of the game itself. And sure, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen where there are developers or publishers who are basically trying to scam gamers, but what we're seeing them do here is Nintendo say, oh, it's to crack down on this content, when really they can just crack down on basically anything they want at this point, which is what is worrying. They, of course, always want to frame it as, oh, they want to protect you, and then they aren't really just trying to protect you from like spam games or e-slop titles. Many of these new guidelines discuss sensitive content and include specific rules for what qualifies as sensitive content in the first place, listed criteria that would be considered damaging to the Nintendo brand include sexualization of children, overly sexual content, discrimination and hate, exploitation of social issues, content that clearly exploits a topical and controversial social issue, tragedy, or catastrophic event, instructing criminal activity, and political statements, content that overtly supports or criticizes real-life countries, organizations, or ideologies. So, guys, I guess if they ever make like a 1984 game, you're not going to be able to get that on the Nintendo Switch 2. While I completely understand them trying to crack down on ultimately what could be deemed as illegal content, like sexualization of children, right? The problem is that then they throw in the vague, overly sexual content. They allow hentai games on the Switch. So are you saying suddenly that all of that content isn't going to be allowed? What about overly violent content? We know if one goes, typically the other goes. So are you no longer going to allow the Mortal Kombats on your platform? What about Cyberpunks, where you're going around and you're killing people and there's gore and there's violence? Like, it is a slippery slope. Again, I completely understand illegal content not being allowed, like sexualization of children, if those guidelines are very clear, because what happens if a character appears to be underage to somebody, right, but they're actually like a 25-year-old character, like in Stellar Blade? Could they technically ban a game like Stellar Blade because one person thought that Lily looked like she wasn't 18? Like, again, we're talking about very vague guidelines for what could ultimately be a very pivotal moment for developers. There are developers whose content might not be able to be published anymore. When they say overly sexual content, I want very clear, concise guidelines, like I'm sure these developers want, and we're probably not going to get that. So it says Nintendo states in the guidelines that it reserves the right to not distribute a game, but claims it offers the guidelines to help developers understand its reasoning in certain situations. We encourage you to take this information into consideration when developing content for potential release on our platform and before submitting such content to Nintendo. It also disclaims that the guidelines are not an exhaustive list and that sometimes determinations may be made on a regional basis. So, that definitely isn't good, in my opinion. I can get behind them, making sure that the descriptions of games are right and that it can't be promoted with AI images because that's false advertising. I totally get that, but this is very drastic and I don't trust companies, especially Nintendo. I mean, over the past couple of years, I've talked so many times about Nintendo and, of course, Sony and Valve forcing censorship upon developers. We see it happen time and time again. I mean, Nintendo and Sony censorship flipped again. Neptunia Rebirth's trilogy and DLC was canceled in the West on the Switch because it was deemed inappropriate. Nintendo might be changing their content policies. This was 2 years ago, almost 3 now. Lewd shoot 'em ups faced censorship issues. We, of course, have just pages and pages of problems here. And of course, over the past few years, Nintendo hasn't just been facing censorship problems, but also pricing problems. They were slammed for charging $90 for the Switch 2 re-release of 8-year-old's Breath of the Wild. We, of course, know that gamers were pretty ticked off with the price of the Switch 2 and all of the accessory prices and even the specs, because even though it's a new console, it's still hardware that's 5 years outdated. Nintendo has ticked people off with the Pocket Pair lawsuit. People have just been furious that they won't allow another game that is similar to Pokemon to exist. So we're just talking about a bunch of different things. And listen, I want Nintendo to be releasing good content. I love the Switch. I love a lot of Nintendo's games, but unfortunately, you can't just trust them to go after the illegal content or just the scam content. They've worded this in a way that gives them complete and utter control, and a lot of people are now calling them out for this. Nintendo fans get what they deserve. The way this is worded is almost like it's coming out of the mouth of a credit card processor. Makes you wonder. There are many reasons I gave up on consoles. This is one of them. I already said I wasn't interested in Nintendo. You don't have to sell it to me. Yeah, we don't need our kids seeing a bunch of perverted games in the eShop, but it's not just kids that use the Switch, and you can parental lock your console, and either way, kids probably shouldn't just have straight up access to the eShop so they could spend money on your credit card. Yikes, what a sad time to be alive, and nothing has changed since the NES days, apart from allowing violence and blood. Sad day for Pyra and Mithra. So they are facing a heck of a lot of backlash over this. Of course, I will be keeping my eye on the situation to see if they issue sort of any clarification. But while I do agree that they should potentially crack down on straight up falsely advertised products that use AI images and fake descriptions, and then you buy it and it's a complete and utter scam, I don't agree that they should be cracking down on what they're deeming sensitive content, which really just falls under anything they want to slap the sensitive content label on. So I'll be keeping my eye on this, but for now, that's all that I really had to discuss in this video. Let everyone know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, give it a like, and if you didn't, give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I'll talk to you all again in the next video really soon.